Housekeeping announcements. Next week, we are not going to have a session. I've got, my kids are doing some college visits, and the times we can talk to professors are right during this talk, so we won't be doing it next week. But then the week after that, we've got David Horowitz coming to talk about how to get actionable learning from retrospectives. So that's going to be exciting. But today, we've got Austin Chadwick with us, and Austin is a developer and also runs or part of the Mob Mentality podcast. So if you like what you hear, definitely go over and check that out. It's a good place to, good podcast to follow. So with that said, Austin, I'll turn it over to you.
Awesome. Thanks, Mark. I really appreciate you inviting me to this. This was a ton of fun to create the slides for this and reflect on my experiences, and I'll share it with all of you, and hopefully there'll be some value and some good conversations that come from it. So yes, I'm doing a talk on what mob programming is not. It sounds quite clickbaity, but I'll help clarify that in just a second. And the main thing I'll be clarifying it with is the just sharing principle. And then we'll be going into some mobbing misconceptions I've seen out there, and maybe some mob role anti-patterns and mob collaboration anti-patterns that I've seen out there mobbing in the wild, so to speak. And so a little bit about me, because it kind of ties into the just sharing principle. Despite the title, I'm not going to be coming out and saying like, universally, I'm claiming that you over there and you over there, you aren't mob programming. That's not real mob programming and that kind of thing. It's more from this kind of just sharing principle perspective, which is, hey, I've been mob programming full-time about 6 years now. Here's some things that have worked well in my context and things that have not worked well in my context. And so instead of it being more as like, this is universally what works and what doesn't work, it's more like, here's what hasn't worked in this context, and here's what has worked in my context. And so maybe that will serve as more of something to try, experiment in your context to see what works. And so I'm not claiming your context is the same as mine and all those kinds of things. It's more sharing for experimentation. So that is kind of the qualification for everything. And without further ado, I'm going to hop into some mobbing misconceptions. And I will highlight that a lot of the images I got here are from teams around the world, mob programming, that they shared with us. We have one of the links in the card that Mark shared for this talk is basically companies around the world, or organizations that do mob programming. And so I got those images from that link. Yep, yeah, there's a link inside of that link that Mark just shared. Thanks, Mark. Which is kind of fun to see. So the first one, I'll start out with some real common ones, probably stuff that's been talked about before. And then as the talk goes, it'll get more and more nuanced with my unique experiences, I think. The first one, the most common one I've seen is, isn't mobbing, 3+ people watching one person type? I found this image a while back, with the stormtroopers watching this office worker, and this office worker looks quite intimidated. And so I've actually heard stories of this where, you have a company that hears about mob programming and they say, hey, let's do this thing. And so they set up, a ton of mob stations, and they get their developers to sit in front of, big screen TVs. And then, someone walks by and they're like, oh, I want to see this mob programming. And it's one person typing, working hard, and 3 or 4 other people on their phones, not engaged at all. So they're not even really watching that person type. Or maybe they're just watching, right? So that's kind of a more salient, one side of the spectrum example. But I've even seen this happen, in day-to-day mobbing full-time, where people become less engaged, and it's basically just the driver doing his thing with other people watching or not watching kind of thing. And so that's when I've seen it go poorly. And so that kind of comes back to what I call community definitions. And this one comes from Woody Zuhl for mob programming. So all the brilliant minds working on the same thing at the same time in the same space and on the same computer. And so everyone is working on the same computer. And one thing that I've really seen help increase engagement, and we'll get more into these later, are mob roles. So they're like different things you look to do while you're in the mob. And so obviously, if you're doing driver navigator pattern, someone is verbalizing the code out loud. And so it's not just silent watching someone type. For it to go into the computer, the code to get into the computer or whatever the work is, it's got to go through someone else's hands. So an idea from your head, it's got to go through someone else's hands, the driver. And then there's these different roles. So a mobber is listening at the edge of their seat, asking questions till they understand, sharing ideas with the navigator and driver. You can be researching the problem at hand. You can be researching the problem that's coming up. You could be sponsoring people, so someone said something and the rest of the mob missed it. You want to, bring that up and be like, hey, there was an experiment there we should try. Looking for things to automate, looking for things to refactor, helping document and draw what's going on to help the rest of the team understand. So there's lots of things to do to really turn up the good on mob programming that really increases that engagement. And so I think mob roles might be the anecdote for that kind of problem, at least one of them. But that's definitely one of the misconceptions I've seen with mob programming. And then probably the most common one is, once someone hears about mobbing, isn't that really slow? You have, 3 to 4 people, let's say, now instead of working separately and getting stuff done, they're all together and they're all working on one thing instead of 4 different things. Just inherently, that seems backwards and slower. And so, so you got this team of turtles here moving slow. And I do grant that from a certain perspective, it inherently does seem slower. However, are the alternatives faster? So before I was mob programming for the last 6 years, I have done traditional waterfall at one place. And then I've done Scrum kind of from scratch transformation to, fairly cutting edge Scrum for a while. And in those two environments, and what I've heard and seen a lot in the industry is basically this thing where people work on one part of the product and then they hand it off to the next part of the product, right? And so basically the main competitor to mob programming and pair programming is code review or handoffs and things like that, right? And so, so one person, a developer, works on some code, and then let's say you're on a Scrum team, and then he's like, okay, well, for it to be done, I need another developer to review it. And so then he passes it off to someone else, and then that person's not ready to receive it, so that work is waiting for that person. And then after it's reviewed, he might have some feedback, and that is kind of what's shown here. Let me turn on my laser pointer. So this is for that one ticket, it's being kind of passed back and forth in code review. And there's all this waiting time. That's the gray here. So this is an image I took from Dragan Stefanovic. And there's links in that one card that cover his great material. But it shows all this waiting time for this one ticket because it's waiting for people to review it. And then for the Scrum team I was on, there were multiple code reviews that needed to happen from different parts of the stack. And then after that, it was required for it to go through manual testing and automated testing from different teams and different people. And then so it'd be passed to those people, and then they would find things and then pass it back to the developer. And then after that, there was kind of this hardware integration phase where it needed to work with the firmware and the hardware and be tested on the floor. And so basically all the system was separate. And even though each person felt like they were going fast, if you keep your eye on the ticket, the feature, the bug fix, whatever it is, the lead time was quite long. Quite generally, it was, multiple days if it was going really fast, and often a week or two. in my experience. And so, again, just sharing from my experiences, other people's experiences may vary. But to me, that doesn't seem very fast. And so I think there's maybe two different definitions of fast here. And this is going to the other community or Woody Zuhl definition of mob programming, which is let's work together well and turn up the good on flow efficiency. And so there's this idea of resource efficiency, which is keeping me busy or keeping each person on the team busy. And then there's flow efficiency, which is what brings the highest throughput or cycle time for the feature, the bug fix, the market experiment that you're trying to get out into production. And so that is a very different perspective. So from a resource efficiency perspective, mobbing might be quote unquote slower. But in most places I've worked at, cycle time and throughput are the most important things, not keeping people busy. People don't necessarily, the customer doesn't care that the teams are busy. They care that, oh, is there a new feature or a new experiment that we're learning from our customers about and things like that. And then in that way, cycle time, which is the amount of time per unit, per feature, per, release to production, that kind of thing, that would matter much more. And in that regard, what I've loved about mob programming is when it's done well, the whole system is in the room. So if it's something quite complicated, like I was talking about that one scenario where there's different developers with different technology skills, there's different QA skills that are needed, there's different firmware, hardware skills that are needed. If the whole system is in the room, including the product people, there's no waiting for anybody. And each person is building in the quality of their unique perspective and giving that feedback. And then it just all in one go, we can go to production. And so that's how in many mob programming teams I've been on, releasing to production multiple times a day is quite often the norm because the whole system's there. We're not waiting for anybody. It can just go, especially when it's combined with great practices like test-driven development and continuous delivery. And so I think it is a misconception, at least in the mob programming I've experienced, that mobbing's slow because from a cycle time, it's inherently faster. And then throughput tends to be faster too, in my experience. Another one is, isn't mobbing boring? And I've definitely heard stories of this where, let's say there's a long build or, you're back in the mode where you're watching one person type or you're doing work that's not very interesting. And so literally, like you click build and then it's the four of you watching it build for 5 minutes, or you're running a slow end-to-end test and that kind of thing is happening. Or, you're just not really jiving with the people you're working with or that kind of thing. And so I do grant that that is probably many people's experiences. But in my experiences with mob programming, it is almost always having a lot of fun and getting a lot of stuff done. And I think when you have the whole system in the room where everyone's kind of bringing their unique thing and everyone knows ways to contribute, whether by listening or asking questions or looking for automation or looking for code smells, it's highly engaging. Also, especially if you're switching off Drive or Navigator fairly often, either with a timer or something like that, it's super engaging. And so because you are getting stuff done, and that's naturally exciting to see value being delivered, to see your idea being tried out, to see your friend's idea being tried out. And so I think in one way, the mobbing I've experienced is quite engaging because it's just a natural byproduct of doing great work together. And then also, hopefully you work on the build times and hopefully, you as a mob help keep the feedback loop really fast with good TDD practices and breaking up larger projects and things so that the build times are fast. And to say something controversial, have lower amounts of end-to-end tests that are slow and flaky and have more of the tests that give that great fast feedback. you'll eliminate a lot of the waiting in the mob, so to speak, because usually someone in the mob knows how to make those kind of things happen. And then if you are waiting for a build for 30 seconds, you're hanging out with friends and you can have a good time here. So here's some of the people I've mobbed with, commenting on Pokemon cards my kids were having me take to work, or someone brought their dog for one mobbing session, or here we're using Aaron here as a Christmas tree, and Halloween, people dressing up. So these are some examples of the fun we've had while mobbing in person. And also, mobbing remote is also a ton of fun. And so, in the bottom here is my friend Art, who is quite proficient in puns. So if there's empty space for a little bit, you're going to get an Art pun. And, so remotely you can, share animals and, talk and really get to know each other, right? Because in good teams, I've seen this in some coaching books as well, that to be really effective communication and working well with others, it's good to get to know each other on a personal level as well, because you build up that trust, and that naturally leads to better idea sharing, experimentation, and innovation. And so remotely and in person, getting stuff done and having a lot of fun has been my experience. Another one, and so this is kind of getting into more recent experiences and reflections for me, isn't navigation 100% equal every session? And so there are two sides to this coin. So one problem you can have in mobs is that navigation is dominated. And let's say that, an anti-pattern I've seen before that can go on for days. And my co-host on the Mob Mentality Show, Chris, often tells the story where in one of his first experiences of mobbing, he navigated for such a long amount of time that his voice hurt and that kind of thing, right? And so obviously you want to equalize the navigation as much as possible. And so one person navigating the whole time is probably an anti-pattern because others aren't sharing their ideas, they're not contributing, they're not giving feedback on the ideas, they're not trying out their ideas. Maybe there's not questions being asked so other people can try their thing as well. But on the other side of the coin, I've also seen what I feel like can be an anti-pattern is where the navigation must be so strictly equal that people think mobbing has gone wrong if, let's say, you're mobbing for 30 minutes and every person hasn't mobbed exactly, let's say it's 3 people, 10 minutes, right? Just like any conversation or any teaching or any working together, it's going to ebb and flow. So let's say we're working on the front end or back end code and we're, test driving behavior. I might pick up and navigate more than the others for a little bit there because I'm just excited about test driven development and I love it. And I see like seams, we can write a seam here, we can do this, we can refactor that. And so my navigation might be higher than others for a little bit because I'm excited and I got some ideas. And as long as it naturally equalizes, that's great. Whether there's like, okay, Austin got some stuff out of his system and let's try some other people's ideas for now, or we're switching now to full stack. We need to deliver this and we're doing CI/CD, which is an area that I'm less proficient at. Then someone else will pick up the navigation more because they're really good at that. And so I've seen that it doesn't need to be so wooden that something's gone wrong if someone's navigating for a long time for a little bit. As long as it's like a good conversation where you're looking for that natural flow where people are picking up navigation more as as they have more expertise or as they're learning. So I've seen it as well where someone may navigate for a while because they have expertise in whatever it's working at, and then someone else is in the mob is like, okay, I'm ready to start navigating this myself. And so they'll start navigating a ton with the other person guiding them, saying like, okay, yes, that is a good way to make a seam for a unit test here. Or, yeah, let's try that out and see if it works. And then when it doesn't, say like, okay, so that didn't work because of this or that problem with how we're injecting our dependencies or something like that. And so sometimes navigation may take days or weeks to equalize. It doesn't have to be all up front, every 30 minutes, everyone is perfectly equal for navigation. Because I think the problem that can happen there is that if people are being shut down mid-navigation, then it kind of squashes kind of that free expression that people have. They have that psychological safety in a mob where they're excited and they're going to share and they're going to navigate for a while. And if that gets squashed to like make it equal so that everyone's equal in every 30 minutes or so, it kind of breaks the flow. I think the natural flow that can happen. Maybe not always, but just something to watch out for. Another one is structure. Isn't mobbing always timer-based or structure-based? And so I think what's awesome about mob programming is that, you know, those definitions that Woody came up with in the beginning, like all the brilliant minds, same place, same time, same computer, and let's work together well, turn up the good on flow efficiency, and, you know, get the whole system in the room, those kind of things. It's actually quite flexible how that can work out. Some people and some teams' mobbing style is very structured, and some are more loose, you know. And so what I want to say here is, instead of, you know, refining or constraining what mobbing is, kind of open it up and find what works for you and your team. I've been on some teams that are highly structured, you know, very short timers, very strict navigation. And at that time, we loved it. The people in the mob loved it. It was almost like the Zen flow of, you know, following the structure very carefully, and very specific TDD loops and very specific Kanban maneuvers that were very structured, and we're using a timer. I've also been in mobs where it's a lot less structured, no timer, kind of natural breaks of who's navigating and who's driving. And a lot less Kanban cards. I love Kanban cards and I love the organization, but it was just a few high-level cards, and we can kind of keep the flow going by what we are putting into the code, and didn't need to make everything into a very terse, small Kanban card. And I think both can work really, really well, as long as, you know, kind of the other principles of mobbing come through, which is where, you know, everyone is contributing and learning, right? And so, you know, if I'm driving for 30 minutes and I'm having a great time and everyone else is great navigating, that's good. You know, it doesn't need to be broken up with the timer necessarily if you're kind of doing the more freestyle mobbing. And then it's like, okay, I'm tired driving now, someone else can pick up the driving or pick up the navigation. And as long as, like a good conversation, people recognize when, oh, someone else hasn't been contributing to the conversation, and it doesn't need to be a timer or a formal facilitator. It's just the team picking it up and saying, oh, let's hear from so-and-so. What do you think about this? We haven't heard from you in a while. Or I haven't driven for a while. Do you mind if I drive? That kind of thing. And so I think, again, instead of constraining it, maybe opening it up to experiment and find what works for your team. Is adding structure an experiment that will help improve your team? Then try it. Is reducing structure something that might help your team with where you're at right now? And so, so often beginning mobbing has a lot more structure, and that's very helpful, but it doesn't need to stay there. Nice. Yeah. And this is another one I've been thinking about a lot more about lately is, isn't mobbing 100% consensus or vote-based? And so, again, I've seen in my experiences kind of dramatic spectrums of collaboration styles within mobs. And so some are very passionate about consensus, and everyone needs to weigh in before every step is made in a mob. So, okay, are we going to write a new test, and the test is going to be this name, and then everyone weighs in on that. And then there's a vote. And also with kind of retrospectives and how teams improve, it's very consensus and vote-based, you know, like you can think of the typical retrospective or lean coffee where everyone votes up or votes down on certain things, and actions aren't taken until the whole mob has weighed in. So that's kind of on one end of the spectrum. But I've also been on maybe more rowdy mobs that are much more, you have much more autonomy in the mob, and much more freedom, and much more experimentation. And so maybe the person who's navigating just starts going, and they just navigate in a certain direction. And maybe it's going in a way that maybe the rest of the mob isn't on board with, but we'll learn through experimentation by letting that person navigate their idea through. if it works or not, and then we can discuss. Or maybe someone just starts experimenting on their own computer while the driver and navigator are doing stuff on the mob station, and so it's kind of almost that parallel experimentation going on, almost like a researcher role or an automation role, where they're trying something on their own and they're taking that initiative without asking the mob for permission to do a thing. I've even seen this happen with mob splitting, where it's just like, hey, I'm gonna go over here and do a thing. Anybody want to come with me? And maybe the mob will split into 2 pairs, or it'll be a mob of 3 and someone trying something in solo for a while. And there's just not this waiting for the mob to weigh in. Everyone's just kind of doing their thing, but also collaborating and sharing information as they go. And so I think mobbing should be open for experimentation with both styles to see what fits well for your team. And mobbing doesn't necessarily mean one of those 2 styles of mobbing. And then going to the image that Mark generated for this talk, this is kind of what this slide is about. Rowdy mobs, or no rowdy mobs are allowed. And so I think it's been really rare in my experience to see people being disrespectful or and things like that. But that is certainly an anti-pattern. And what I like to go to here is kind of the radical candor grid. Is one of my go-tos with this is, kind of the high psychological safety is where we are challenging directly or sharing directly, right? As opposed to, oh, I didn't like what Bob navigated, and I'm going to go talk about him behind his back. It's kind of like, oh, Bob, why are you navigating that? I don't quite understand that. You go directly to the person in the mob, but you are very kind and respectful in how you do so. And if you kind of stay in that top part of the grid, that's where innovation and healthy and fun and getting stuff done really opens up. Where in the other parts of radical candor, or not radical candor, is you're being kind and respectful, but you're not expressing your concerns, your ideas, your potentially concerns and things that might go wrong with what's happening with the code. Or you are challenging directly, but you're being disrespectful in how you do so. So usually I've seen that happen here and there with mobs, where we kind of get out of that good zone of radical candor in the top right. But usually from some gentle prodding, we get back into the radical candor quite quickly, which is really, really good. And so, yeah, it's definitely an anti-pattern to look out for. And sometimes the team needs to retrospect on it, or revisit things like the prime directive when you're editing code, as being like, we're doing the best we can, and the people who wrote the code before are doing the best they could with the knowledge and resources they had at the time. Let's be respectful, but we can still be critical of the code. And and so I've also seen it in a mode where it kind of mobs might get into ruinous empathy, where the emphasis is so much on kindness that they maybe lose the directness. And I've been in some mobs that are actually quite rowdy, because the trust is so high that people are like challenging each other, making bets, joking around, having fun. But in their way, in that context, they were actually being kind, because the other person wasn't offended. And so I think rowdy mobs can be allowed if everyone in the mob sees it and understands it as being respectful, but also challenging each other directly. And so I think, there can be the synergy of having some rowdiness, quote unquote, as long as it's still the team still feels it's kind and respectful. Another area isn't everyone in the mob only technical? And to be honest, most of my mobbing has been largely with the whole system, for most of the time, being largely technical. And good collaborations here and there with people who aren't technical, whether it's customer or product or marketing or that kind of thing. But I've had the awesome experience lately of having someone be in the mob who comes from the product background, but is also technical. And it is wonderful, because every time you're naming a variable or naming something on the screen or whatever it is, that domain, that product domain, is immediately available. And there is literally no waiting. It's like, what do we call this in our business world or in this world? And the name is right there. Oh, it's called this and not that. Oh, isn't that a weird name? Well, in the industry, this is how the customers use it, so that's why it's named this or that. So to kind of, it's almost like the ideal in my mind of domain-driven design, because the domain is being baked into the code every every TDD cycle and every commit, because that domain person is there, and that's quite great. And so on the left here is in this particular domain was golf, and so Randy here has been in mobs lately, and so he can just build that domain right in. And this was a visit we did on a golf course, and so everyone in the mob doesn't have to be only technical, and I think pushing that bounds of bringing more and more people and system into the room improves things. And lately, thanks to Parker here and Aaron, and some experimentation over the last year or so, everyone in the mob doesn't have to be human. Whether it's ChatGPT or Copilot, or Copilot in the browser with kind of more a chat session, or built into the IDE. We've been loving adding AI, quote unquote, into the mob, and I think it's almost like adding another person to the mob, because there are things Copilot or other tools are good at, and there's other things it's not so good at, just like every person. But they do bring some great contributions, and so we'll ask questions, we'll try out their ideas, we'll refactor what it comes up with, and things like that. But everyone in the mob does not have to be human, in my experience. All right. We'll definitely want to leave some time for Q&A, so I'll probably move through these last ones fairly quickly. But I thought it'd be fun to take some of the patterns that a lot of people talk about in the mobbing community and flip them, and see what it leads to. So it's kind of, for those of you, some of you who know me, I'm a philosophy nerd. And so like the term in logic is reductio ad absurdum. So you take the thing that you think is right, and then you negate it, and then see what it leads to. And so, so I'm going to be doing that to some of the things with mobbing and see where it goes. So I was going to do that with the roles first. And so maybe an anti-driver in mob programming would negate some of these things. So a driver who never asks a clarifying question about what to type, who never types anything they disagree with, basically just inflicting their ideas into the code, not listening to the rest of the mob, never using keyboard shortcuts. So I've definitely seen on occasion where a driver thinks they understand what the navigator says, and then codes a long time without break, maybe even verbalizing what they're doing. So it's always good to clarify and ask, like, oh, you said this, did you want me to do this? And make sure that you're implementing what they said. And I've also seen occasion drivers who get navigation, but then just do what they want anyways. And so maybe there's time for that in a more freestyle mob where the driver is kind of trying their thing for a bit. But typically it's a really good practice to be like, I don't think that's going to work, but I'm going to try it anyways, because that really shows trust in the rest of the mob that, like, hey, your idea is worth merit, and since it's code, we're going to find out really quickly whether it works or not. And so you can just try something you disagree with. And also it's good to learn from the rest of the mob keyboard shortcuts. If I was typing the same way I was typing 6 years ago now, I would be probably half the speed I would be at the driver, because there's so many keyboard shortcuts and tricks you can use to get things done a lot more efficiently at the keyboard. That's really awesome to learn from the mob. So yeah, code first, ask questions later, as a driver can be an anti-pattern. The anti-navigator is, so never ask for ideas, never tell the driver your high-level intent. So I use the word never here on these slides purposefully, because sometimes as a navigator, you are just saying your ideas, and that's great. Navigate your idea, have the driver do it. But if you never ask for ideas, that's probably not as healthy. You want to be collaborating with the rest of the team and getting their ideas and trying their ideas out as well. And then the other one is, if you're only giving low-level detail, it's hard to follow you as a navigator, right? So hey, let's rename this method from A to B. Hey, let's go to line 10, new line, forward slash this, that. People are like, what are you trying to do? What's going on? Where instead you say like, hey, let's create a failing test for behavior, have the button show up on the screen after this or that, Then when you drop low level, people are like, okay, I know where he or she's going, and we can follow them. And so these are good things to do and to not avoid. The anti-mobber is never contribute an idea. It's good to share ideas as a mobber. So if you're never contributing your idea, that can definitely be a problem. Staying in that limbo state where you don't quite understand, that's of course good for a while, but keep asking questions till you understand. When you understand and give your feedback to the mob, that can really help the mob move forward. Don't be disengaged. Sometimes it's okay to run experiments on your own, but if you're never listening to what's going on in the mob station, that can certainly be a problem. This one is near and dear to my heart. I've definitely seen the mob anti-pattern where there have been mobs where they weren't refactoring and weren't test driving. And a mob can still make a mess, even though it's a mob. I feel like the chances are lower because there's usually someone who has some degree of looking for code smells and things to refactor. But it definitely it would be an anti-pattern if no one is doing this. And that's the beautiful thing about mobbing is that different people see different smells, and if no one's pointing them out, the code is going to get worse and be harder to work with and have more bugs as time goes. And for the anti-researcher, it's like the opposite quote that Willem put into the mob programming RPG game is to assume we are the first to wonder about this. And sometimes it feels that way when you're doing innovative software development or R&D of any kind, is that we are the only ones in the world, working on this problem, figuring out this certain thing. In some ways, that's true, but very, very often we are not the first to wonder about this. At least with a lot of the problem we're working on. So it's always awesome to be researching things and sharing it with the mob. Sometimes you need to reinvent the wheel for your specific domain, but often you don't need to. So definitely be researching. And yeah, the automationist. If you don't point out repeated manual things we're doing, I've heard of mobs that are largely waiting just for slow, flaky end-to-end tests, and 80% of their time are spent doing that. Yeah, so if there's something that can't be automated away, mobbing is going to feel very ineffective. And so you definitely want to be finding the repeated tasks, automating them away, and doing what you can there. And all right. And also, if you never record solutions, never draw your ideas as a team, or never do it for the team, you can be having circular conversations where everyone thinks they're agreeing or thinks they're disagreeing, but they're really talking about different things. And that can be quite frustrating as a mob. And I've seen it before where it can go on long, half an hour, even an hour, where we keep discovering that we think we're saying the same thing and then we're not, or we're disagreeing and going back and forth and debating, and then we're really not even understanding each other. And software and product is really complicated, hard stuff, but that when you draw it, how many things just crystallize. And so definitely an anti-archivist would be a problem where when the team is struggling with understanding each other, not drawing. Yeah, so I've seen it as well before in mobs where someone shares an idea or points out a problem and the rest of the team just moves on. And if this keeps happening, it's going to be destructive to psychological safety. And so if you're never amplifying the unheard voice, that can be quite a significant problem. And so often it's just paying attention to the mob and being like, oh, so-and-so said something, but maybe the mob's busy. I'll even often write it down as a sticky to be like, oh, let's try out so-and-so's idea. And then after the current experiment, just re-raise it. Be like, hey, let's try this idea. I heard that. It sounds like a good one. And also to make mobbing, having fun and getting stuff done, really celebrate those moments when you guys, when the team discovered something, solution to a really tough problem, celebrate that. And so without those two things happening, it could be kind of destructive to psychological safety and less fun. And so another thing that can be problematic with mobbing, an anti-pattern, so to speak, is if there's no devil's advocate. So this is one of the criticisms of mobbing, and I think it lands if the mob is not critical of the mob's own work. So it's usually good that to play the devil's advocate in the mob. So if they think a certain direction is right, maybe raise concerns or pros and cons about that approach. If you have concerns yourself, raise them. But it's just kind of part of trying to discover the truth together and bringing all evidence to the table. And so being critical but respectful. So being critical of the code or maybe of the idea by trying it out and trying different experiments on it. But the goal is to bring the best idea into production or the best experiment we can, put our best foot forward. And so if everyone is too scared to share criticisms, you can have this just kind of going with the flow type mentality, and that can definitely lead to problems. And it kind of takes away one of the magical things about mobbing is that in the moment feedback to whatever the team is working on. So I have tons of blind spots, and I might be navigating forward, and someone's like, whoa, 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 you're not seeing this thing over here. And so to be that devil's advocate can be really a good thing. So since we are close on time, I'll hit these last ones fairly quick, and maybe we'll get more detail on them at a later, maybe asynchronous offline session. But here's some more collaboration ones. There was an IBM team that was doing mob programming, and they named an anti-pattern the Fight Club, and that was basically what I was talking about earlier, where there wasn't respect and kindness, consideration, respect, and those kind of things. And the mobbing sessions just turned to be out fight clubs, so that you definitely don't want that. You want the honesty, but you want to bring the kindness as well and the gentleness. I've seen mobs flail before, where this talking about before, where you want to add structure, reduce structure. So if it's like someone starts navigating, they get halfway into one idea, then someone else picks up navigation, they're trying out something else over there, and then their idea is only half tried or 90% tried, and then someone else picks up navigation and they take somewhere else completely different. It can feel like the mob is flailing. You're not really trying something all the way to finish. And so it's good to have a punch list, is what one team called it, or a Kanban board or stickies or anything to be like, okay, what is the current thing we're trying? And let's keep navigating that one until it's done, and keep that as small as possible, and then move on to the next idea. And sometimes mobbing sessions lead to a lot of ideation, which is great, but don't let that ideation break the flow of finishing the current thing. So it's like, that's a great idea, let's try it. Let's make a sticky for it or a card for it or add it to the punch list. So someone stepping up and doing that can be quite helpful. This mentality where one idea wins, only one idea can be tried and only one idea wins, can be quite problematic with mobbing. There's a pattern called do both. When there's two competing ideas, you try both of them. In the smallest, safest way, you can try both ideas, do them both. And about 99.9% of my mobbing, we're just always doing do both. But I can imagine if you're not, it's gonna feel rough, right? It's like your idea is not being tried, you feel like you're not contributing. So that can definitely be a problem. Yes, so it's good in the mob if there's someone who's prioritization minded, right? So you just don't want to be working on whatever. You want to spend some time figuring out, okay, what's the highest priority item? And so not only having a punch list, but spending some time to do prioritization. So I've seen that before, where mobs will spend significant time on something that's not top priority. And so just having that quick conversation with the right people, bringing the right people into the mob to make sure what is the most important is being worked on. Also, just like with any good agile development, you want to be slicing. And so thin vertical slicing, because even a mob can spend a lot of time in one layer of the system that is not deliverable to get feedback on. And so I've seen mobs go for a while without slicing, and it can be quite problematic. Last one, and this one has been a passion of mine for a while now, is that businesses and organizations can be very chaotic. And no matter whether you're mobbing or not, it's really good to have an area of I almost like to think of it as like a safe where your team can work in. You know what I mean? The outside world can be quite chaotic and you need to interact with it. But for a healthy mob, you need this protected area where, whether it's the mob station in person or the Zoom or Teams meeting, where you can say, like, there may be death metal being playing out, in the rest of the company, the organization, and things are chaotic and crazy. But in this team, we are gonna, block all that out. We're gonna pull in the most important thing, and we're gonna work on it very calmly, coolly, and respectfully. And I like to say it's like having reggae inside the safe while the rest of the world might be death metal. That's fine, but have that protection so that we don't rush, we don't cut corners, we don't, do things that people even outside the mob may be driving us to do, but it doesn't help them in the mid to long run anyways for us to rush or cut corners or feel pressure or do certain things. And so I've always found it very valuable when there's someone or a whole mob who helps establish, here's the safe space, there's pressure out there, but we're not worried about that. It doesn't help to, be distracted by the 10 different pressures. We're going to focus on one thing at a time and work at a sustainable pace and deliver high quality, and that'll be the most helpful for everybody in the end anyways. So for references, as Mark has shared, I've made a Trello card with a bunch of links on it and the slides for things I referenced throughout the talk. And now for Q&A. We have at least some time, and I have not been looking at the chat, so I'll need some help here.
So there's the Trello card, but if you've got a question, put it in the Slido, and then we can vote stuff up and down there. Austin, do you see that?
Yes, I do. Awesome. So I guess I'll just take the top one.
Sounds good.
Worked. Yeah, does that sound good, Mark? Yeah.
Yes, great.
All right, cool. Have you ever worked with any tools where programming is happening, where multiple devs are editing the same file with their own cursors? If so, what do you think of that approach? I have heard of this. I've never quite done it. If I'm understanding the question correctly, it's almost like a Google Doc where everyone's editing the same Google Doc at the same time, but it's like the same idea, but with code. And I think there are plugins to IDEs that can do this. I think it's different than my experience of mob programming. And I think it would just have the pros and cons of being less in sync. So the pro would be, you could have, rapid experimentation going on. And actually, I go into this mode fairly often. So sometimes you know exactly what to do as a mob, and you're just navigating that and making it happen. And sometimes it's some serious R&D. It's going to take sometimes 10, 30 experiments to figure out what is the right technology or the right tool or the right way to make these two things talk to each other. And so sometimes, we're all in the same call, but we do what one team called parallel programming, where everyone's trying stuff and shouting out what they're learning. And maybe it's two people on a mob station trying stuff, and then one other person on their laptop and another person on their laptop trying stuff, but everyone's kind of sharing what they're learning as they go. I could see it quite effective for something like that. So yeah, those are my raw thoughts on that question. Any follow-up to the person who asked that? All right. I guess next one would be, my team is remote. Logistically, what tools do you recommend for screen sharing, timers, passing control for editing between team members, commit and push to end one round, the next driver pulls and share screen? Yes. So actually, let me, I'm going to jump into sharing screen of Chrome. Do you guys see my screen of a Trello board?
Yes.
Awesome. All right. So there are different ways to mob remotely. So it looked like the one that this person was hinting at Oh, this is Brigham, if I'm saying that right. Is a mob Git handover tool. And so that's kind of, I think, might be the majority style. It's not the style I'm most familiar with, but I think my rough feeling of people who mobbing, they mostly do this. And this is kind of what you said before, where you use a Git handover tool where for all in a Zoom call, let's just say, someone is sharing screen and we're in their IDE looking at their screen. And then when it's time to switch, you do some command line things. It pushes up to Git. And then we switch. So now I'm driving. I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to pull down that code using this Git handover tool. And now we're in my ADE with me driving and the rest of the mob navigating, etc. So that's one style. And another style that I'm most of my time has been spent doing is kind of what you see in this image here. And I think Juan might even be here. So hi, Juan. Uh, and that is we are in an AnyDesk or a TeamViewer session. And this was actually quite natural for us going from in-person to remote post-COVID, is that all the mob stations we were on before with the big screens and everything, those all went into a closet eventually, but we all remoted into those same computers using AnyDesk or TeamViewer. And then it's kind of like in-person mobbing where you're sharing the same computer. You can turn on a timer like Mobster, or there's several other variations. And then when the timer expires, the screen goes black, and then someone else goes in AnyDesk or TeamViewer and clicks the button to take control, and now they're controlling that computer. So it's you're all sharing the same space, whether it's email, whether it's IDE, whether it's drawing, you're all sharing that same computer. The computer doesn't have to be in a closet. It can be a cloud computer. It can be, basically any shared space. But yeah, I think that's what I have the most experience in, and I've seen both work quite well. What I love about the kind of TeamViewer AnyDesk style is that the transition is very quick and seamless. Like it's just like being in person. The driver navigator switch is done and you're there. The con is, someone loves Vim and someone doesn't like Vim. You kind of have to work that out. But even the tools do that really well. I was mobbing with someone who is a Vimmer, and they found a plugin, I think it was WebStorm or PyCharm, that they could switch to Vim mode in 2 seconds, and all of a sudden they're editing with Vim, and it's like, okay, great. So I don't know Vim, but you can do Vim when you drive. Awesome. Next question. What does when you mark your last XP box? Yes. In light of time, I did not explain it super well, so that was a great question. Let me go back some slides. So on these mob role slides, so these come from, I kind of jumped into it without explaining. These cards, so to speak, or these slides come from a game called the Mob Programming RPG. And it's a game developed by Willem Larsen. It is in that card. It's in the list of links that Mark shared with you. And it's a game you can play with your team to learn the different roles of mob programming. And so I guess I'll go to the more simple one. And in the game, you wouldn't have the word never there. In this game, to gain the experience points, you actually do the thing it says there, as opposed to never do it. I added that for the slide. But when you let's say we're playing the game and we're doing FizzBuzz together, and I'm mobbing with Juan, and Juan says, hey, I want to, do this or that. And I'm thinking in my head, oh, you should use the modulo operator or whatever. But I do it anyways, and we type it out and try it. Then I would give myself an experience point in that specific game you can play together as a team that can take an hour or two. And then as you gain enough experience points, you get the badge, the driver badge, or the navigator badge, or the automationist badge, and those kinds of things. So yeah, that's where that comes from. All right, and looking at time, I guess I can jump to the next one. All right, trying mobbing might break some organizational rules, like tracking individual time on stories. Can you describe how GitHub or Git allows sharing authorship? Yeah, great question. Yes, there is definitely a whole set of coaching things that can go along with mobbing, because yeah, it does break it does break a lot of company systems with how they think about work, right? I remember one time I was working at a place where we were trying out mobbing, and we were trying out XP, we were trying out um, test-driven development and things like that. And someone came to me on the side and said, I think what you're doing makes sense, and I think it would make things a lot better. However, I know I'm being evaluated by, individual metric A, B, and C, and so I'm not going to do it because, hitting those metrics is more important to me than basically making the product better and making the team better. And so that was something we had to work through, and so that leads to coaching, with the rest of the organization and talking with, outside the team about what is the impact of measuring, story points by individual, and things like that. What are the side effects of the side effects? And is there another experiment we can run and things like that? And so, yes, there are ways you can set up Git or GitHub. We do it quite specifically where I've been mobbing for the last 6 years, where it is one person's credentials that is committing and pushing, but in the metadata of the push, you can put your names and emails and things like that. So it kind of ties to everybody. But there is some legal requirement that one name be attributed to it. But when it's looked at from a high level, it's seen as the whole team and not one person. So there are ways to do it. I've basically just done it here and there as needed to set up, and then I've forgotten how to do it. But there are certainly ways to do it technically with Git. But yeah, the organizational stuff, yeah, you're opening up a can of worms for sure. So recommendations for
on the other hand, it also helps make some issues visible that might have been hidden before, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, right?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. I think I believe it was Kent Beck in Extreme Programming, or he was quoting someone else, but it was basically if it hurts, do it more kind of thing, or making the pain visible. And I think mobbing does that with a lot of things. It makes you face your demons, but since you're all together, you can fix the problems, right? So it surfaces a lot of problems pretty quickly, but if you collaborate well, you can help solve a lot of those problems quite quickly as well. And then this question was recommendations for offshore engagement when obtaining contribution can be difficult. Let's see, how much time do we have? 2 minutes. Whoever asked that question, you mind giving a 30-second soundbite on what you mean by that? I guess I can speculate. Whenever we've dealt with different time zones, and we usually try to find a common area if you're going to try mobbing where you can both be, so it's not 1 a.m. for me or 1 a.m. for the other person. Find a common area to try mobbing, I suppose. And I think the act of doing mobbing will help contribution, right? So if you set up a very simple kata with driver navigator switch, it kind of forces the collaboration, that structure forces the collaboration to start. So I could suspect that, if you want to start mobbing with offshore, or even just increase collaboration, doing a kata together could be something that could get the juices flowing. But being in the same call and switching driver navigator often helps get that going with some light facilitation, in terms of like, hey, we haven't heard from so-and-so. What are your thoughts on this? Or, do you have any ideas you'd like to try? And then write them down and then try them. Usually happens quite naturally with mobbing. And I think we're at time, Mark, if I'm reading time correctly. Yes. So I don't know if you have any shutdown protocol or we keep going.
Let's see. It looks like there was just one more thing. Jason had a suggestion about
Sure.
being very aware of the emotional temperature of a room, because a timer can drive stress for people and stuff. That's what it looks like, or confusion.
Yeah,
So good point.
yeah, that's a great point, Jason. I love it. Yeah, yeah, exactly. Right. So the timer can be an aid, but it can also stress people out if they don't understand. Like, yeah, it's yeah, that just because they're switching driver navigator doesn't mean that you didn't beat the buzzer to get it done before the time expired or something like that. Or
Right.
if you're in the middle of an idea, you could keep navigating. Just work with the next navigator kind of thing. That's a good point, Jason.
Yep,
Yeah.
and it can also drive confusion because people think they got to hit the timer rather than understand.
Yes.
So.
Yes. Exactly. Yeah. The tool is not our master. Yeah.
So Austin, thank you so much for coming. I'm going to throw those links in the chat here. So if you're interested in those, click those, bring them up in a window so you've got them after the session closes. But thank you so much for doing this. This is great. I know I learned quite a few things. I'm sure everybody else did as well. But yeah, thank you so much. And remember, everybody, no session next week. And then we've got David's going to be joining us after that to talk about retrospective. So thank you, everybody, for coming. Thank you, Austin. And everybody check out his the podcast, The Mob Mentality Show.
Thanks, everybody.